In the spring of 1955, a vaccine meant to end a nightmare became one. For years, polio had been the disease American parents feared most. It came in summer, it came without warning, and it left children in iron lungs, in leg braces, in wheelchairs, or in graves. Public pools closed when case counts rose. Parents kept kids away from movie theaters and crowded parks because no one could say for certain how the virus spread, only that it seemed to find children first. Some families lived every summer for a decade under that particular kind of dread. So when Jonas Salk announced a vaccine that worked, on April 12, 1955, the country didn't just celebrate. Church bells rang in some towns. Newspapers ran the story above the fold, above everything else happening in the world that day. And then the country panicked to get it, immediately, before the next summer wave could hit. Within weeks of approval, 6 companies were licensed to manufacture millions of doses on a timeline that gave almost no margin for anything to go wrong. One of them was a small, well-regarded pharmaceutical company in Berkeley, California, called Cutter Laboratories. Cutter had made vaccines before. They were trusted, established, unremarkable. But the process Salk had designed to kill the live polio virus using formaldehyde was delicate, and it left almost no room for error. If the virus wasn't fully inactivated, the vaccine didn't prevent polio. It caused it. At Cutter, something went wrong. Investigators later found that clumps of virus particles inside the vaccine had physically shielded some live virus from the formaldehyde, letting it survive the process that was supposed to kill it. Quality control tests missed it. The vials were packaged, shipped, and injected into the arms of healthy children across the country, mostly under the age of 5. Within days, doctors in California started seeing something they had only feared. Children who had just been vaccinated against polio were developing paralysis. Not the disease circulating in the community, the disease coming out of the needle. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Vaccines were supposed to be the end of this story, not a new chapter of it. But the pattern was undeniable. Paralysis showed up first in the arm that received the shot, then spread. Children who had been running and playing days earlier couldn't stand. Some couldn't breathe on their own. Families who had lined up in relief to protect their kids were now sitting in hospital hallways, watching the exact nightmare they'd tried to prevent unfold anyway. The scale of it took time to surface, because the failure wasn't isolated to one bad batch. It was spread across multiple lots that had already left the building. Health officials scrambled to trace which vials had gone where, but distribution records in 1955 were nowhere near fast enough for the speed of the damage. Vaccinations continued in some areas, even as reports of paralysis were already coming in from others, because no single authority had the full picture yet.
By the time the government pulled Cutter's vaccine from circulation on April 27th, just 2 weeks after the vaccine's triumphant announcement, it was too late for hundreds of families. Historians estimate around 40,000 children developed abortive polio, a milder form. Roughly 200 were left with some degree of paralysis, many of them permanently. 10 children died. And it wasn't just the vaccinated children at risk. The live virus in some cases spread to family members and classmates who had never been near a syringe, turning a manufacturing failure into a community outbreak that rippled outward from a single injection site. One of the earliest warning signs came from a pediatrician who'd vaccinated a healthy 5-year-old on a Monday and was treating him for paralysis by the following week. He reported it. Then he heard from a colleague treating an almost identical case in a child who had received a shot from the same batch number. Those 2 phone calls, between doctors comparing notes because something felt wrong, were part of what finally forced federal health officials to stop and ask whether they were looking at isolated bad luck or a pattern with a single source. What makes the Cutter incident so unsettling isn't just what happened, it's how close it came to happening completely unnoticed. There was no independent system in place checking vaccine safety after it left the manufacturer. No unified national reporting network fast enough to catch a pattern before it became a catastrophe. The country had built the science to defeat polio, but not the infrastructure to make sure that science was actually being followed correctly, batch by batch, company by company. The public reaction was immediate distrust. Vaccination rates dropped. Parents who had been desperate for the shot weeks earlier were now refusing it entirely, afraid the cure was more dangerous than the disease. Some of that fear lingered for years in a country that had just watched safety fail in real time. But the incident forced a reckoning. Investigations exposed how loosely vaccine production had been regulated up to that point, relying heavily on manufacturers to police themselves. In the aftermath, the U.S. government tightened vaccine licensing requirements, created stronger federal oversight of biological products, and built the foundation of what would eventually become a much more rigorous vaccine safety monitoring system. The Cutter incident is now taught in public health history as the moment America learned, at a brutal cost, that a vaccine isn't safe just because the science behind it is sound. It's only as safe as every single step of the process that makes it. Cutter Laboratories itself faced lawsuits from grieving and disabled families, and in a landmark case, a court ruled the company liable for damages even without proving direct negligence in a single act, reasoning that a manufacturer producing something this consequential owed an almost absolute duty of care. That legal precedent reshaped how pharmaceutical liability worked in America going forward. The vaccine that came from other manufacturers, made correctly, went on to nearly eliminate polio from the United States within a few short years. By the early 1960s, case counts that had once run into the tens of thousands annually had collapsed to a small fraction of that. The science Salk built was never the problem. The gap between a laboratory and a living room was.
There's also a quieter footnote to this story that rarely makes the headlines. Salk himself never patented his vaccine, famously saying the sun couldn't be patented either, and that framing shaped how the public understood what should have been possible. A scientific breakthrough delivered purely, without a manufacturing shortcut anywhere in the chain. The Cutter incident showed how far reality could drift from that ideal when speed was prioritized over verification, even by a company with no intent to cause harm. It's a strange kind of tragedy, not a villain, not a conspiracy, a process with one flaw in one facility that no one caught in time. And for the families who lost children or watched them lose the use of their legs, that explanation never made it feel less devastating. It just made it feel more preventable. If you want more true stories where good intentions collided with hidden failure, subscribe. This channel exists to make sure the hardest lessons in history don't get forgotten.